everybody, welcome welcome back to my channel. My name is Leah Catherine and this is Leah Sees Movies, and today I am talking about Spider-Man No Way Home, Caucasian Spider-Verse, and the third highest grossing domestic film of all time. Yeah, I'm gonna go into it non-spoiler for like 2 minutes and then just go right into the meat of it. It's made $253 million this weekend, so if you really wanted to see it, you probably already have. And you probably saw it twice, like I did. Non-spoiler section, I really liked it. And if you have, if you saw my Venom reaction, or if you follow me on Twitter, I've been ambivalent towards this movie at best. I have found MCU Spider-Man, despite really liking Tom Holland as Peter Parker, it never felt like he was standing on his own 2 feet. It felt like the first movie was just like Iron Man Jr. The second movie was like, I miss Iron Man, I'm gonna look for the first father figure I can, and Jake Gyllenhaal is there, so sure. The thing that made Spider-Man one of the top 3 like biggest superheroes of all time, and it never felt like Sony and Marvel treated him like that. They didn't treat him like he could hold his own series, his own trilogy, and it was just really frustrating for me because they weren't bad movies, and in fact there were really great aspects to both of them, generally with the villains. But storyline wise, I was never really impressed, and this by far is my favorite of the MCU Spider-Man, and it's probably one of my higher ranking of the live action Spider-Man movies. I would say maybe still falls kind of short of Toby for me, as far as, maybe it's the nostalgia talking, but I rewatched actually Thursday night before I saw it for the first time. I've seen it twice. I rewatched the first Spider-Man and the second Spider-Man, and it just, I don't know, it hit different. I was like, it still connects with me emotionally in a way that even with this movie that I really, really liked, it didn't quite get there for me. I saw a lot of people talking about holding back tears at certain pivotal scenes, and I was just like, this is sad, but I wasn't crying. Whereas in like the first Spider-Man, when all the New Yorkers start just throwing junk at the Green Goblin and just like, when you mess with Spider-Man, you mess with New York. It's so cheesy, but it gets me. Like, literally crying, just choking up because makes me so happy. I don't know what it is, but so those movies still really mean a lot to me, but this was a really great time, and I'm really happy I did. My first theater, weirdly, was kind of subdued. My Friday night theater in IMAX, like probably 100 and something people there, just COVID everywhere, and and people were screaming and yelling and jumping out of their seats and laughing and cheering and like talking to the screen. It was just why you want to go to the movies. For a lot of people who are not going to do that, totally understandable. But if you can, and if you feel safe and comfortable, if you don't want to go on a crowded day, I get it, but I think it's a really invaluable part of how much I enjoyed this movie. There's not much you can say about the plot that isn't technically a spoiler. However, I do think that's kind of the delineation that's made between normal people and those of us who are terminally online, who have heard every leak, every rumor, every, on-set still photo, every theory video, like everything that's been going on since this movie was announced, what, 3-4 years ago? Like, if you're completely apart from that, and I feel like the people in my second theater were, then this movie is full of really big surprises. If you are not, maybe not as much, but that doesn't mean they don't feel good. And I think that's what's the important part, because if it had been something of, oh, once you know what the twist is, you don't care anymore, which there are certain things where that applies, then that's not a good movie. But I think what's so effective about this is, even though I wasn't necessarily surprised by any of the big twists, except for one at the very beginning that made me happy, it was still just as impactful. I was just as happy, not as happy as the people who like really didn't see it coming, but it was just as enjoyable an experience, and it was just as enjoyable an experience the second time when I knew exactly what was coming next. This, I think, was the first time Peter Parker as Tom Holland really got to shine as his own hero. We got to see what makes him tick, what makes him think, what kind of person and hero is he trying to grow into without all of those other male influences. And, well, that's a lie. There's more influences, but without, I want to say, without the overbearing influences, it wasn't so much as I'm trying to build myself into the best version of myself. It was I'm trying to mold myself into being someone else. And I think without that someone else to try to replicate, we got to see Peter Parker be Peter Parker. And it also helps that in this movie we get the most Aunt May, Ned, and MJ that we've gotten in any part in this series. So much of his narrative has been wrapped up in the men he's trying to emulate that in this one, getting to see the influence that his friends have on him, that his aunt has on him, that New York has on him, it's like, oh, this is what makes him feel like a three-dimensional, fleshed out human being. This is what I have been waiting for. And weirdly, this movie is an origin story. This is literally the birth of Spider-Man that we've been waiting for this whole time, and not just a teenager with spider powers. It's kind of wild that his origin movie happens to be at the end of like 6 appearances in the MCU, but this part of me is like, I almost feel like you could watch this movie first and then be like, oh, that's Spider-Man, that's who he is, that's what makes him him. And then almost see his other appearances. Like if you like watch this and then Civil War and then all the other ones, it would track. Obviously there'd be references you didn't understand, but the character development wise, this is where you see him come into being from the kind of child version of himself that he was. Ugh, that's enough non-spoilers. I want to talk about the good stuff. Spoiler alert. With the benefit of hindsight on my own rambling, I'm going to say this and then put it before my rambling. I like this movie a lot, but I do have a lot of plot issues with it. There's a lot of plot conveniences, there's a lot of just accept it and move along that you have to take as the viewer, and we do because we are so overwhelmed with the successful kind of use of emotion to make you go, I care so much about these characters, I'm not even gonna question why they're in the situation in the first place. However, I'm not very good at that. I nitpick everything. So I want to make that clear when I say that now, so that when you see me later say, OMG, I was just so happy and emotional about Toby and his camp counselor vibes and Andrew Garfield's catching MJ. I really did love that stuff. However, I'm so nitpicky about plots and why they happen and why characters make the choices they do and what are the nuances of how spells work that I'm going to go on about that at probable length. We'll see how much I cut in editing, but that doesn't mean I don't like it. It's because I care that I nitpick. I'm not just start adding that before I do my thoughts, because otherwise it just sounds like I hate it, and that's not true at all. I'm just a bad communicator. Actually, no, I'm not a bad communicator. I just think there are 2 levels in which a film can succeed, and that is emotional value and plot coherency. And I think this movie succeeded far more in the realm of emotional attacks than it did on plot coherence. Yeah, there we go. Nailed it. That's send it to print. That almost made sense. Hashtag Doctor Strange was right. Hashtag Aunt May was wrong. RIP though. Okay, so I'm actually gonna start not with the obvious. I'm gonna start with Matt freaking Murdock, who, I'm not gonna lie, the first viewing of this movie, after his only scene, I spent like another half an hour going, is he gonna come back? I was just waiting for it. The final scene where the lizard dude, what is his actual name? I don't remember. But when he's coming after Ned and MJ in the school, when he's going after the box, I was like, Daredevil, Daredevil, Daredevil. But just briefly, he saves them and leaves. That's all I want. No. And it's funny because I've been the #1 opponent of anyone else distracting from Tom because he needed this time to stand on his own. But in this case, I was just so excited about Daredevil and the MCU and just seeing Charlie Cox again. I was like, actually, I want Daredevil. Just a smidgen of Daredevil would have made my day. It didn't happen, but even a little law scene would have been nice. He just showed up to be like, now your case is handled, and then he left. Disappointing. So movie starts picking up right where we left off in Far From Home. His identity has been exposed by Mysterio. Everyone thinks he's a villain. Everyone's running after him. I think immediately what we get in this movie when we see all of his scenes with MJ is there's this intimacy and actual comfort that they have with each other, which obviously in the first movie Zendaya as MJ was just a 3-scene appearance, and she was very disaffected and snarky, and it was okay, cool, but you didn't really get to see her. Far From Home was actually very cute, got the little flirty stage, but in this one, which is funny because at this point, it's been like a week since the flirty stage, they felt like people in a very established relationship, which I don't know if the movie timeline is kind of aware of the fact that the relationship would be very, very new, because, okay, but in terms of the filming experience, it felt like a couple you could root for, which of course is probably helped by their real life relationship. And I just, again, like I said in the non-spoiler part, I think it did make all the difference. Not just that Zendaya got to have more screen time, we got to see more sides of oh my gosh, not Mary Jane, whoopsies, Michelle Jones Watson, her awkward side, the weird stuttering. You can still see her kind of struggling to be open and to make friends and communicate, and it was good. I really appreciated that performance out of her. Ned was kind of always as great as he always been. Jacob Batalon has perfectly nailed the charming side character who also makes you really feel for him. We got some hints of what I believe Hobgoblin, I think, is the potential villain he may turn out to be. He seems to have magical affinities. He has promised and sworn not to become his enemy and try to kill him, but now the fact that he does not know who Peter Parker is by the end of the movie, I am skipping to the end when I just said I wouldn't, means that maybe he will become a supervillain, which still seems out of character, let alone being Peter's best friend, but it kind of opens the door to him to maybe have an issue with Spider-Man, which I don't see how, but perhaps that leads to him becoming enemies with Spider-Man, not knowing that it's Peter, and of course not knowing about their shared history. Maybe. I feel like it's hard to believe, but maybe. I really appreciated the time they spent, especially with all the college rejections, which by the way happened in like November, which is not when college application responses come in. They come in like March or April. I feel like someone should have been aware of that, but whatever. Yeah, there's early acceptance, which sometimes does come in like November, December, but I mean, most people only do one college early application. Like they don't do 3 of them, which we did see with Peter. So I don't think that made any sense, but I'm assuming it's been a long time since the writers have applied to college. But I appreciated that they spent some time to show the after effects of having his identity exposed and the effect that it's been having specifically on Ned and MJ and them not being able to get into college, which then didn't make sense because Flash was blackmailing him to say he's his best friend, even though his actual best friend could not get into college because of his association with him. One of my biggest issues, like I said, wasn't a huge fan up front of the trailer when it first came out was how, you asked him to completely change time and space because you're having a bad life. Which in the movie, which I would appreciate, Doctor Strange is like, that's a huge ask. And then he goes along with it, which is very stupid. And then B, he somehow messes up the spell because he keeps being like, oh, I don't want to retell them. And I'm just like, dude. And that's still wrong. Like, but the good thing is in the trailer, I thought they were just playing that off as like, that's the plot. And we're supposed to take it at face value. Like that wasn't incredibly stupid. And the good news is the movie goes, this was incredibly stupid. It was a stupid idea in the first place. It was stupid of Doctor Strange to agree. It was stupid of Peter to keep being like, but what about, but what about, but what about, and keep adding addendums to things. Like Happy? Who cares if Happy knows you're Spider-Man? Jesus Christ, dude, move on. And so I was happy that the movie said, this was all very stupid. The series of events that created this situation, quite stupid. What I don't like is that, I'm gonna get to that later, but then the major themes of the movie are also stupid. And that time it's played completely straight. Like this was a stupid idea and we all should agree that this was stupid. And then later it's like, oh, we have a bunch of villains from alternate universes that need to leave because their very presence here is a threat to the multiverse as we know it. And not to mention just a threat to New York because they're literally all villains if that wasn't apparent from them blowing crap up the second they got here. And then it goes from that to, but we can't send them back to Werewolf because they're gonna die. And Doctor Strange is supposed to be the mean one because he's just like, that's their fate. That's life, baby. And I'm like, no, he's right. Like, he's right. He was the correct one. And then, so that's a whole moral dilemma. And then it's like, we can fix them. And I'm like, okay, but even if that works, You fix them, you cure them. Dr. Connors isn't a giant lizard, despite the fact that he is pro-giant lizard. Like, it isn't like Doc Ock where it's like, oh, his arms are controlling him and like they took over his brain and that's why he's evil now. Dr. Connors willingly became a giant lizard. He was pro-giant lizard while a lizard. He was like, would you like to join me in my lizarddom? So they cured him and now he's a person. What's to say he's not going to immediately go back to his world and re-lizard? Like, that just doesn't make any sense. Electro straight up was like, oh, I'll agree to your plan to like fix me or whatever, and then immediately was like, but if this goes wrong, I'll fire you from the inside out. Yeah, why are we keeping these dudes around? What is the logic? It's the right thing to do. Okay, I lied. I said I wasn't gonna skip ahead, but I'm absolutely going to skip ahead. So let's go from the idea of let's keep the villains around because we are going to cure them and make them good people Lilo and Stitch style and hope that they're not super villains when they go back to their worlds and then they won't die. Which doesn't even account for the fact that there's no, like, for sure knowledge that you're not going to send them back to their world. They'll immediately go back to the form they were in that world and just re-die again. It's all theoretical. There's no proof of concept. They just do stuff. And in the meantime, just buildings are destroyed. Aunt May dies. Aunt May dies. And she gives the with great responsibility speech. And while bleeding, she's like, we made the right choice. And that's supposed to be an emotional moment. But it was really stupid. I'm sorry. And all this to say, because I realize this sounds like I hated the movie, and I didn't. I loved this movie as much as one can when you think the basic premise of most of the scenes is stupid. Like, it's very well executed, heartfelt, well acted, stupid. And I don't mean that in a Venom 2 way where stupid's the point. I mean it in the sense of just I, as a person, cannot relate to, understand, or justify the decisions made by the lead characters. I don't think we ever made the right choice. I think we should have hit the button. I was on Doctor Strange's side the whole time. And I also think the failure of this for me is that the with great power comes great responsibility scene, and with Uncle Ben, because like I said, I rewatched Spider-Man right before watching this. When Uncle Ben dies, it's because Toby Mcguire's Peter does not stop the thief because the thief had robbed someone he was mad at. It was a completely petty and human reason. He did something petty. He was like, you know what? No, I'm not going to help you because screw you. And then that guy killed his uncle and it was like, oh my gosh. Peter did something human and petty and small and it cost him his uncle. And that's horrible. And it's a lesson that, you know, I'm not going to allow myself to be petty and human and small. I'm going to be better than that. I'm going to hold myself to a higher standard. And that worked for me. But hey, this dude, it's not like I'm letting someone get away with a robbery. Straight up, this dude's a murderer. I know that for a fact. He came here, immediately started blowing people up, just threw a bomb at my aunt, and then she's gonna be like, we did the right thing. And I'm just like, I don't know. I think because it took it so far above the level of like, and you could just say it's an exaggeration of I'm going to hold myself to a higher, almost inhuman standard of kindness. But I don't know. It took me, and speaking for myself, out of the movie a little bit because I was just like, this isn't even like a relatable choice of being a better person. This is like, oh God, what's that tweet where it's like, I'm not even a superhero, but all my uncles are fine. Like, that's literally how I feel. Just like, how are you gonna let your aunt get blown up? And then she's like, well, she said I made the right choice. Not saying you should go decapitate him, but hit the button, let go, let God. Like, that's where I'm at, personally. Even after the building's blown up, the villains have escaped, all of this has happened. As far, like, I don't know if Ned and MJ knew that May was dead specifically, but, like, you know, it's on the news, there's been a casualty, several injured, the building's blown up, and MJ's like, yeah, I'm gonna hit the button, and Ned's like, no, not yet. What do you mean not yet? What happened to, if I don't hear from you, I'm gonna hit the button? Stick to your word. Because it was great. Later we met the Peters, and when Tom Holland's Peter tries to press the button, she's like, no, because you need the space to talk. I got it then. But at the point that you're sitting in Ned's grandma's living room, just sad, depressed, can't find your friend, his aunt is dead, a building's blown up, why would you not hit the button? It doesn't track. It doesn't make any sense. It got really long-winded. I like this movie so much, but it's a central conceit that I find hard to relate to, on not just as me as a person, but as a spectator. I found it a bit of a stretch. Also, the MCU said fucking Uncle Ben, and I think that's hilarious. They said not only is he not present, referenced via suitcase, we're gonna give his most famous line to Marissa Tomei, because screw him, that's why. And we've seen it twice already, and that's fair. But also, now that I have mentioned the Peters, yay! So the biggest surprise that wasn't a surprise to most of us who use the internet, Andrew Garfield and Toby Mcguire return in their roles as other Peter Parkers. And it's funny because I talk a lot about how the previous movies for me were held back by Peter Parker trying very hard to be other people. So ironically, in this movie, the people who helped teach him to be the best Peter Parker he can be had to be other Peter Parkers. Sure. I don't have too much to say about it. I mean, the cheering and the hoopla when they arrived on screen was delectable. My second screening, as I mentioned, was absolutely crazy. I did not manage to think to record it when Andrew Garfield showed up, but I did record when Toby Mcguire showed up.
I'm Peter Parker!
All the actors had very great chemistry with each other. It's like Andrew and Toby slid right back into their roles. You can see how all their characters differ, but obviously the similarities are overwhelming, and not just in backstory. Their awkwardness, the scientists, they just bounced off each other so well that I almost forgot the fact that all of the villains had very conveniently disappeared to allow them this bonding time. It's kind of like in Justice League when everyone's looking for the mother box and then everyone's just talking and the mother box is like outside on a cop car and you're like, shouldn't we be watching that? And then fucking Spindly McSpiny shows up and is just like, mine, and leaves. Like, that's how I felt about the box in this movie. As much as you appreciate, oh, we need Peter Parker bonding time, it's like, if you're this whole set of supervillains on the loose, unrestrained, in Electro's case, more powerful than he's ever been, and you know that that box can send you home to die, you are hunting Peter Parker down with everything you've got. Not going to buy more waist belts, which is what Electro appeared to be doing. He was just like, oh, that box could kill me, but first, the army surplus store. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But it did give us the time we needed for Peter on Peter on Peter time. Toby Mcguire was so good. It's just kind of older, wiser, self-care Spider-Man. He was just like, we gotta grow, we have to learn, no self-doubt, no negative language about yourself, talk positively. I was just like, yeah. And it was, like I said earlier when I was talking about watching the movie and how the cheesiness of all the New Yorkers sticking up for Spider-Man like really gets me. Something about Toby, and maybe it's the nostalgia, but also of course him as an actor, he sells it for me. Like, it's the cheese and just the kind of effusive kindness, which feels a little bit inhuman, but just like it translated so well. Like, at one point, Andrew Garfield calls him, he says he's dressed like a cool youth pastor, and I mean this with love. It worked. It's the correct vibe. It was just like Tom Holland's Peter Parker and his two dads who are also Peter Parker. Like, that dude would take me to summer camp and teach me a helpful lesson. Perfect execution, I think, on him. Unfortunately, and I'll get back to this, I think he had less of an arc than obviously Tom Holland's the main focus, which makes sense. But we get this little moment with Andrew later that was so cathartic and one of the most emotionally satisfying scenes of the entire movie. And unfortunately, because he was so in wise Spider-Man counselor mode, Toby's Peter doesn't really get a scene like that, even with Green Goblin, and I feel like that, like, if we could, I feel like there's a lot of scenes, specifically on face focus close-up shots, that could have been just cut, like a couple seconds here and there, because there's a lot of lingering close-up shots that maybe we could have cut that to have a moment between him and Goblin after he is cured and after he had stabbed him in the back, literally, because that's like one of his biggest regrets. I mean, his friend's father, who he did also cared for, ends up dying in a burnt-out husk of a building after trying to kill him with his glider. He then delivers that body back to his house, not telling Harry because that was literally his dying wish. And then Harry then blames him for the death of his father and tries to hunt him down. Like, that's everything that Norman Osborn represents to him. Like, that's a lot of trauma and feelings and emotions that if there had been like a couple of seconds of them interacting, like actually being like, hey, Norman, without the goblin in your head, like, we're gonna have this face to face, because also you've been dead for quite a long time in my view. So I would have appreciated him getting to have his own little mini arc the way Andrew did. But other than that, I really enjoyed every scene with him. Even him catching the glider when Tom Holland was trying to kill Green Goblin. It just big blue eyes, and you're just like, he doesn't want this for me. He wants better from me. And he just translates that so well. Speaking of my beautiful little mini arc for Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker, him saving MJ after she falls off the little Statue of Liberty, which for some reason was the set of the final act. A weird choice. Very X-Men of them, but a choice. But I think everyone in the theater audibly gasped when MJ fell off, and not because we've never seen someone fall, and I think not because we actually thought she was gonna like be Gwen Stacy'd, but just the first of all, it was shot exactly the way Emma Stone's shot was, like the same arms, hands, the slow-mo. We see Tom jump for her, get knocked aside by the glider, and then we just cut to Andrew. Literally, my entire audience was just like, there, like, you could feel the emotion of it. And again, this is a movie where sometimes it's hard to give it credit for things because so much of it is based on our knowledge of previous movies. Because someone who walked into this movie straight does not know why Andrew is crying when he lands at the bottom with MJ in his arms. But for the rest of us watching the movie, oh, it was so cathartic. It felt so good. And it was just like this little moment of salvation for him. A recreation of the worst moment of his life, except this time he saves the girl, and yes, good shit. Well done. Especially because most of the time Andrew's Peter was the kind of awkward, not as weirdly, because he was people kind of decried him for being too cool when he was Peter. It's like he was the awkward one. He's just like, I love you guys, and they're like, okay. He's like, oh, I don't have as cool villains, and so for him being the awkward one, he also got to have this amazing, emotionally impactful scene. It was just mad Spider-Verse vibes, guys. Like, it's real Spider-Verse-y. I'm just saying. Spider-Verse-y. How old is Miles in the MCU at this point? If we assume he was not dusted, and so he's at least 5 years older than he was in Homecoming when we met Childish Gambino as the Prowler, where he said, I have a nephew, he's growing up in this neighborhood. But we don't know how old that could be. That could be 3, that could be 8. If you think about an 8-year-old, and then 2 years from Civil War to Infinity War, everyone gets snapped. 5 years, 7 years later, I'm just saying Miles could be like 15 years old, and Tom Holland apparently wants to play golf and be a dad now, so if he decides to step aside, I'm just saying. However, it doesn't seem like he's going to do that because a new trilogy was already announced, but then they're saying, oh, maybe it won't be Tom Holland again. I don't know what's going on with that. It doesn't seem like they could do a recast at this point because, and weirdly enough, this movie is an origin story. Okay, so if you're like me, or know people like me, or are me, then you're not a fan of this iteration of MCU Peter Parker because he was following in other people's footsteps too much. He didn't have a real sense of personal identity. He had too much money. Like, we all wanted broke Spider-Man, and this time he's the billionaire's apprentice. He has $1 billion suit. He has a Karen in his ear. He can do things. He's been to space. He's we haven't seen a lot of friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, except I think in the first 10 minutes of Homecoming, in which case he spends that entire 10 minutes calling Happy, being like, can I come over? Not a lot of friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And in this movie, they just say, hey, if you have been bothered by that, we're starting over. We're literally gonna start over. They're like, we're giving you broke Spider-Man. We're giving you sad Spider-Man. You know what? This suit is homemade. Like, it's a whole new Spider-Man. He has no connections to the billionaires. He has no connections to the Avengers. He's not going around telling everybody his name and address anymore. Like, they've rebooted the entire series as far as we know him. And I'm like super excited about that. And also, like, how is it fair that he gets 6 movies to be 6 movies to be origined and then gets another trilogy? That's crazy. But it made me really excited. Like, all the things I didn't like are being addressed and literally erased. And one of those things is Happy. My God, they're probably gonna throw him in the Ironheart show. But other than that, no more Happy. 'Cause I'm happy if you feel. I realize that not everyone shares my opinion on Happy, but I think, why? Why? Even Aunt May was trying to break up with him this whole movie. Like, it's a bit of a clinger. Get a life, bro. Oh, that's gonna get me when in the next movie he's in every scene. It's gonna happen. It's gonna get me when he's in every scene of Ironheart is what's actually gonna happen. But also, if you were like, hey, what's the point of Ironheart when we already have Iron Spidey? No more Iron Spidey. He's wearing spandex again. As much as I appreciate stripped down Spidey, older Spider-Man, he's graduated high school, theoretically will be going to college soon, especially because no one knows he's Spider-Man anymore, and he'll definitely have the grades and the smarts for it. I have a lot of questions. Like, I'd be very surprised if there isn't a bit of a time jump in the next movie, only because if now we have 17 to 18-year-old Peter Parker and Tom Holland is 25, and granted he has a very, very young face, but I'm assuming he doesn't want to still come back in like 3 years, 2 years and be playing 17 again. So I'd be surprised if there isn't like a little bit of an age gap and we're to get to Spider-Man as like a sophomore or junior in college. There's a lot of other stuff happening. It's feasible. They were gonna go quite a few years of just Spider-Man staying local for once, and or I guess going to Boston, but it'd be really sad if they were like, we're going back to our roots, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man in Boston. But another thing I also really enjoyed about this movie is I think it actually had some of the best fighting that I've seen in a Spider-Man movie in a while. Not necessarily the most creative, like I actually think they probably could have been more creative with the actual Spidey-based skills, the swinging. Like, they're very acrobatic and flexible fighters. Like, use that to the best of your ability because that's what keeps it fun. But the actual hand-to-hand in this movie was impressively, like, down and dirty. There was a lot of just punching people directly in the face, bleeding. Like, I think Tom's, like, had a burst capillary in his eyes, so he just had like a bloody eye the entire second half of the movie, and it just made it feel a lot more real and grounded, and I just give them a lot of credit for it because there are several scenes, especially in the very final scene between him and Green Goblin, where I was like, damn, oh, well, okay, we're not holding back. Like, this is what it looks like when someone with super strength just goes ham on another person. And I think that was a very good decision. I think it would have been really easy to like web them up, kids, and it would have been nice and very Spider-Man-like. But there's a level of rage and vengeance that you cannot really translate when you're just like webbing people up. But you can with punches to the face. And so I think that was just a very well-made choice. The problem with the MCU and all of the things in the MCU is that the more information you give us, the more questions you open yourself up to. For example, what is the TVA doing? When does this movie take place? If this movie takes place like right after Far From Home, which is like 9 months to a year after the end of Endgame, and then during Endgame, Loki escapes, starting Loki the television show, If the TVA is still active at the point where Spider-Man takes place, a bunch of people being yanked from their respective timelines, put into new ones, and then altered and sent back, when the whole point of the TVA is like, no, we're gonna refresh people and then like keep everything exactly the way it was. Would the TVA then take the cured versions of all these villains and then kill them anyway? Because they would massively screw up the timeline by not dying. Yeah. It's not something that I ever expect to be addressed. It's just one of those things about, if you have them in the world, and we know that there is a time authority that is trying to keep things exactly the way it was, and then we have Spider-Man, we can change their fate. Would you? Like, sorry, this is my brave impression. And then we got Spider-Man over here trying to change their fate. Wouldn't that just be in direct opposition to the entire purpose of the TVA? Like, how sad is it if you think about the entire plot of this movie happening, and then at the end everyone forgets about Peter Parker and it's completely useless because the TVA kills them all? I mean, Peter, I guess, wouldn't know about it, but rip. Can't wait for Brooke Bitch Spidey. Other thing I don't understand. This is what happens. I'll be like, I like a movie so much, and then like, all this bitch does is complain. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to be like this. It's just how I am. I don't really get how the final spell worked. If the idea was the spell was messed up and everyone who knows Peter Parker or Spider-Man is being drawn into the Tom Holland Peter Parker universe, and okay, sure, villains who know Peter is Peter. Peter Parker obviously knows Peter is Spider-Man, but then he goes, well, this will solve it if everyone forgets who I am. But does that mean everyone is, because like Dr. Octopus does not know that Tom Holland's version of Peter Parker is Spider-Man. He just knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, period. So does everyone in every universe forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, including other versions of Peter Parker? Because I don't get it. Like, you accept it in the movie and then the plot moves on and you go. But they didn't know that his version of Peter Parker is Spider-Man, so it seems like it requires every person in every multiversal universe to forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, including other Peter Parkers. Like, that's the only way that works. That seems like a much bigger problem. So other Peter Parkers rediscovering web powers and crawling up the walls? Like, how does... So I wanted to go briefly, just due to my own inability to be brief, I'm going to try to emphasize, briefly discuss the return of all of our villains. Don't care about Lizard Guy, I'm gonna say that off bat. Anyway, next, Electro, Jamie Foxx. Love the way they just hand-waved the fact that he was a completely different character. Same powers, and literally that's it. They're like, we realized that they made an error when they hired Jamie Foxx, and then was like, what if we Steve Urkelified him and then gave him a comb over and a like the nastiest looking wig you've ever seen in your life, and he talks weird and it's very uncomfortable for everyone. And then we hired Jamie Foxx and was like, what if we made him a nerd? But like a stupid one, like a Party City nerd. That makes no sense. They realized that and they didn't have an explanation for why they just didn't do that anymore. So they just had Connor say, hey, didn't you have a comb over before? And he was just like, I'm different in this world. I like who I am in this world. I grew a goatee in this world. Like, none of it makes any sense. And I don't care. You hired Jamie Foxx, this is what we should have gotten. I actually would have liked him to have a little bit more nuance than he did. Because it's like they upped his cool factor and then downplayed anything else. But I also just think that's kind of a weakness of the Andrew Garfield era villains. They weren't interesting. Like, they were kind of fun to some degree, but they weren't anything to write home about. They did not have the same kind of nostalgia that Willem Dafoe and Alfred Molina can just mentioning them made the audience go, ah! Like, no one was like, yeah, Lizard Guy, I was wondering where he was. So I think it's kind of just the state of that their original forms weren't that interesting, so bringing them into this new universe, they weren't going to give them that much of an in-depth exploration. But I do love that they just went, we're just going to make him cooler. Don't ask questions, he's cooler in this world. Moving on. So moving on. Alfred Molina as Doc Ock. Fun. I liked his yelling. I liked his severity. I liked just the presence he has on screen. I was happy to see him. I was almost sad when they made him like nice again. Like, I realized he was a good guy originally and that there's no reason he shouldn't be nice. But he's so good at villainy. Like, they fixed him. Like, it was just like, damn it, fine. And Willem friggin' Dafoe. That creepy little man. Yeah. That is a face that you will see in your dreams and in your sleep paralysis, and he's still there 20 years later, haunting, absolutely haunting, very creepy and still pitiable, which is what makes it work. And I want to give a shout out to the costume designer, because when they had him go to the homeless shelter and they gave him that green and purple hoodie coat combo, brilliant. And then when it got partially ripped off but he still had the hoodie on top, like under the actual Green Goblin suit, just so good. There is a cosplayer, someone who has already started their costume. They are artfully ripping up a hoodie and it's gonna look great. And it did look great. I was just happy to see Willem Dafoe back. I wish him and Toby could have had a longer moment. C'est la vie. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, etc. if you enjoyed this. Do you know how Doctor Strange's spell worked? Did everyone in every universe forget who Peter Parker is Spider-Man? Does that include other Peter Parkers? If you know the answer to that question, if I'm totally off base, please let me know. If you don't want to do any of that, but you've watched all the way to the end of this video, thank you. I still really appreciate you. You can follow me on Twitter at Leah Sees Movies, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace!